1998 is probably the greatest year for gaming. Yes, 2001, 4, and 7 are tough contenders amongst many others. But look at any article or forum post on the matter, and you'll see that 1998 is always either number 1 or 2, where the others diverge wildly. There is simply no other year that had as many games that were not just high quality, but were important to the medium's development as a business and an art form. Obviously, you have the likes of The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, which served as the template that every subsequent action-adventure game would base themselves on. There's Xenogears, whose narrative depth has arguably only ever been surpassed by a handful of titles. There's Half-Life, Metal Gear Solid 1, Pokemon Red and Blue, StarCraft, Unreal, Gran Turismo, Star Trek Pinball. These and several other games not only hold up in many respects almost 3 decades later, but they permitted the existence of so many other games that followed after. Now, when I see this same argument being made by my fellow gamers in favor of 1998, there is one game that, sadly, is almost never cited alongside these titles for both its quality and relevance, even though it really should. And that game is the Japanese RPG Panzer Dragoon Saga. Don't just take my word for it. Almost every review for the game says it is a 9 out of 10 at worst, and a few of the reviewers even said it was on par with or superior to Final Fantasy VII. But is that true? Well, as somebody who has played Panzer Dragoon Saga, I can confidently say no, but it's close enough in greatness that I wouldn't dismiss the question outright. But what is it about Panzer Dragoon Saga that would make such a bold comparison warranted in the first place? To start, it has a wholly unique combat system that consistently keeps you engaged and excited. Its musical score has a grandiosity and majesty that puts it in the conversation for one of the all-time greats. It has a brilliantly minimalist approach to storytelling, a style most often associated with the likes of Dark Souls or Shadow of the Colossus, but that Panzer Dragoon Saga did before any of them. And best of all, these and other elements remain almost as impressive now as they did back in 1998. With this in mind, the question that follows is why is it not held in the same esteem as other games released that year or with JRPGs in general? The answer is what, in my opinion, makes Panzer Dragoon Saga one of the most tragic games in the history of the medium. Cast your mind back to 1995. It was a time when Sega was still a major player in the gaming market, producing not only hit games and consoles, but ones that were competitive with Nintendo's output at the time. Though they enjoyed enormous success with the Sega Genesis, they were going to have to change their strategy as they entered the 5th console generation. Not only did they have to compete with the Nintendo 64, but there was an emerging competitor in the form of the PlayStation 1. By the end of 1995, the Saturn ended up selling only a third of the amount that the PlayStation did. Worse yet, the PlayStation had a potential system seller on the horizon, that being the aforementioned Final Fantasy VII. When that game was revealed for the first time back in February 1996, the enthusiasm that the gaming public felt was equal in level to the panic that the higher-ups at Sega felt. They didn't have a JRPG nor a console seller that could offer their customers what Squaresoft was offering with FF7, nor could they bring Final Fantasy to the Saturn, due to Squaresoft working exclusively with Sony. But luckily for Sega, an internal development team came to them at the right moment. Team Andromeda, the developers for Panzer Dragoon and Panzer Dragoon 2's Y, told their bosses that the next game in the franchise would be a JRPG. Sega said that they could have all the money they would ever need under one condition: they make the game better than Final Fantasy VII. Yeah. Obviously, in hindsight, we now realize just how big of an ask this was, because Final Fantasy VII is one of the greatest, most important video games ever made. Nonetheless, the team felt that they could do it, and quickly got to brainstorming over what they could offer gamers that Final Fantasy VII couldn't. FF7 had pre-rendered backgrounds? Then Panzer Dragoon Saga would have fully 3D worlds. FF7 didn't have voice acting? Then Saga would be fully voice acted. Final Fantasy VII had Nobuo Uematsu doing the music. Okay, they were screwed no matter what they did, but still, the soundtrack that Saori Kobayashi and Mariko Namba came up with is, in my opinion, one of the top 50 video game soundtracks ever. This was the philosophy that underlay Saga's development, and though they ultimately succeeded in creating an all-time great game, the actual process of getting there turned into an absolute nightmare. It's one thing to say that you will do better than Final Fantasy VII, but it's another when you actually have to follow through on that. It's one thing to say that your game will have fully 3D environments and then try to implement that on a console that was terrible at rendering anything other than 2D sprites. Though the final result was beyond impressive for the time, the models and FMVs nonetheless struggle to make this transition between dimensions. Surely though, it would at least be pretty easy to add voice acting to the game. Well, believe it or not, the voice files and FMV sequences took up the majority of the space on the game's 4 discs. So the developers had to find some way to fit all of that data onto just 4 discs alongside a fully 3D game with wide open spaces and verticality, something that was completely unheard of at the time. But the most complicating factor, arguably, was Sega's laissez-faire attitude towards Team Andromeda, to let them do what they want as long as it was perfection. This led to a rebellious atmosphere between Andromeda's senior members and the new talent they brought on to manage this massive project. Though there were a number of amazing ideas from both sides that ultimately made it into the game, finding a clear vision that both sides could commit to took about a year of infighting. Unfortunately, this was not time that Sega nor Team Andromeda could afford. The game was supposed to come out in January of 1997, the same month and year that Final Fantasy VII would release. However, due to the lack of direction, the project's scope, and the technical difficulties they faced, Sega was forced to postpone the project by almost a year exactly. And in turn, Final Fantasy VII and the PlayStation 1 ate up a significant portion of the market that the Sega Saturn would forever miss out on. Worse yet, though the extra time was appreciated by the developers, it did little to alleviate the stress and the pressure. In the final year of development, the crunch time was relentless and unending. The best staff members could hope for was to work until the early morning train left, where they can then go home and sleep for just a few hours before coming back to work and starting all over again. Others opted to just stay at the office for months on end. Unfortunately, the working conditions got so bad that it resulted in the death of 2 people working on the project. One died in a motorcycle accident, which the game's director, Yukio Furitsugi, attributed to the stress and tiredness that he was experiencing working on Saga. As for the other employee, when he wasn't working on the project during the weekdays, he was having to take a plane to go look after his ailing parents. This combination of unconscionable miseries led this employee to self-terminate. Both of these deaths, naturally, affected the whole staff at Team Andromeda and Furitsugi in particular, who said that he was particularly close to one of these employees. In an ideal world, Team Andromeda would finish the game to honor the memory of those 2 employees, and make it so great that everybody would want to play it. That success would, in turn, maybe, justify the team's immense sacrifice. But as much as we gamers might vocally proclaim that we want games to be delayed, to ensure their quality and success, and to protect the physical and mental health of the developers, Panzer Dragoon Saga proved that sentiment isn't universal. While the game was critically acclaimed, nobody played it. Where Final Fantasy VII sold over 3 million copies in its first 3 days of release, and ended up being the second best-selling game on the PlayStation 1, Panzer Dragoon Saga only sold a maximum of 130,000 copies in its entire lifetime, with roughly 2/3 of that being sold in Japan. If it released 1 year earlier, it might not have only sold better, but it would have moved Saturn sales just as FF7 moved sales of the PS1. Now one might ask, well, if the game is that great, why has it only sold 130,000 copies in the last 3 decades? Well, unlike most of the greatest games ever made, which have been ported multiple times, Panzer Dragoon Saga stands out as being stuck on its original hardware. Unless you have an original copy of the game, you cannot play this game legally. If you were to attempt to do that though, you're going to have to shell out thousands of dollars. This is especially true if you only speak English, because less than 30,000 English language copies were produced, making the game exceedingly rare. And worst of all, the likelihood that the game will ever receive a modern port or remaster is exceedingly low, due to a strong possibility that the game's original source code was lost. All of that work, the stress, the death, would result in a game that was an undeniable masterpiece, but one that virtually nobody would ever be able to experience. To Fudatsugi, the only good outcome, aside from the praise of the few people that played Saga, was that he now had a benchmark to measure all of his future miseries against. If things got bad in the future, then hey, at least it wasn't as bad as working on Panzer Dragoon Saga. When I learned about the game's development history, I had to play it for myself. I had to do my part to preserve its memory. Ideally, if I could get more people interested in Saga, that small effort might partially help motivate Sega to outsource development on a remake, and in turn, retroactively give the work that Team Andromeda did the praise and attention it deserved. So, for the next several minutes, I'm going to go into detail about all the things that make Panzer Dragoon Saga great, and then tell you how you can play the game for yourself. Finally, in the spirit of trying to get people to play the game for themselves, I will not be spoiling anything about the game's plot beyond what happens in the first half hour, so you can watch the rest of this video safely. The story of Panzer Dragoon Saga follows a character named Edge, a name that's aged about as gracefully as Selphie from Final Fantasy VIII, though for entirely different reasons. Edge is a mercenary hired by the state, an entity known simply as the Empire, who controls the entirety of the continent Edge lives on. The Empire is interested in technology that existed from an ancient yet highly advanced civilization known as the Ancients. I promise the naming conventions get better from here. One day, the Empire hires Edge to guard one of their teams of excavators. What was expected to be a relatively calm mission quickly turns hectic when an unknown monster goes berserk in the underground excavation site. Though Edge and his team are able to subdue the monster, this encounter inadvertently brings Edge in contact with what the Empire were trying to find. Inside a monolithic slab rests what appears to be a young woman, who we later find out is named Azel. Shortly after making this discovery, a team associated with the Empire arrives and proceeds to shoot everybody who encountered Azel. This includes Edge, who they shoot off a cliff. Miraculously, Edge somehow survives the fall, though his fortune is immediately threatened when a horde of ancient monsters arrive to attack him. But Edge's godlike amount of luck has yet to run out, as a literal dragon comes out of nowhere and saves Edge. Before Edge can process what happened, the dragon proceeds to create a psychic link with Edge, where he is bombarded with images of past dragon riders, Azel, and a mysterious tower. Once the link is completed, Edge realizes that with the power of the dragon, he can get revenge on those who killed his fallen comrades, and hopefully also figure out what the Empire is up to. From this point, the game alternates between two modes of gameplay. There are on-foot sections, where the gameplay is reminiscent of your typical JRPG. Go to settlements, buy and sell weapons and items, potentially find secrets, and advance the plot. This makes up about 20% of the game. For the other 80%, you will be flying on the back of your dragon. Generally speaking, with each new area you encounter, you will be flying around looking for some sort of key to help you advance to the next level, all while hoarding loot. But of course, after flying for about 30 seconds, there will be an enemy encounter. Now, if there's one thing about Panzer Dragoon Saga that stands out, that holds up immaculately 27 years later, it's the combat. It is an ingenious combination of the traditional Final Fantasy active time battle system with Panzer Dragoon's rail shooter roots. A combination that sounds as paradoxical and impossible as Cloud and Tifa shippers reconciling with Cloud and Aerith shippers, but nonetheless works harmoniously. The combat system accounts for the core gameplay of rail shooters, which is to dodge projectiles and relentlessly shoot. It does this in two key ways. First, with the positioning system, where you have to consider your dragon's position in respect to the enemy every second of the battle. Note this circle in the taskbar. The triangle in the center represents the enemy, and the golden marker is Edge and the dragon. If the marker is in the green, it either means you're safe from damage or you'll take the least amount of damage. If you're in the red, you're in danger. And if it's neither color, you're at medium risk. Ideally, you want to continuously move your dragon so it's in the green, although occasionally you might want to be in the red because that might reveal a weak spot. This constant consideration of where Edge and the dragon are provokes a greater level of involvement than your typical JRPG combat system. Now, the second way Saga accounts for rail shooter gameplay is by emulating its speed. The game has three main methods of attack. One is Edge's handgun, where he attacks a single enemy, the other is the dragon's lasers, which is a multi-attack, and the third is the dragon's ultimate attack, which the game calls Berserk Mode. The first two types of attack have dedicated buttons, which you are encouraged to use not just because you want to attack before the enemy does, but because the game encourages you to finish the fight as quickly and efficiently as possible. If you finish fast without taking damage, you get a higher rank along with more experience and money. Though this sounds like it could be stressful, it's really not. You pick up on an enemy's attack patterns quickly. Granted, one might think that this would make every subsequent battle with that enemy type boring, but thankfully, there's just enough random variables at play, as well as enemy types, to keep each new battle fresh and exciting. One last note on the combat is that depending on the battle, you might need to employ a strategy that requires more attack power compared to defense, more agility compared to attack power, etc. Thankfully, if you find that an enemy or a boss is exploiting your weakness, you don't have to grind for levels or find a special weapon or armor set like you do in other RPGs. You can simply change the dragon's stats on the fly. Though be wary, putting more points to attack power does come at the expense of the other three stats, that being defense, agility, which determines how fast your gauges refill, and spirit, which governs your berserk abilities. This is a really solid compromise for JRPG fans that tend to enjoy these games specifically because they like having party members with differing abilities. Instead of having one character who's a tank and another who's a mage, etc., you have one character that can be all of these archetypes depending on what the situation calls for, and it works wonderfully. Though I think objectively the game's standout element is the combat, my personal favorite element is its approach to storytelling and world building. As I said earlier on in the video, it has a minimalist style, where much of the story and history of the world is purposefully obscured. It's reminiscent of Fumito Ueda's games, namely Shadow of the Colossus and especially Ico, which came before. Though those two games were responsible for perfecting and popularizing that style, it would be incorrect to say they did it first. Just like in those games, Panzer Dragoon Saga has you roaming around generally barren landscapes with only a few points of interest within. Those points of interest are sometimes keys that help you advance, but more often, they are the ruins of the ancient world. With each new dilapidated building, monster, or seemingly alien piece of technology you come across, your mind cannot help but ponder how they all came to be. Like with all those other games though, Saga only offers a handful of answers, which keeps the player trying to piece together a complete picture long after the game is done. While you're playing the game though, there are a couple of elements outside of the story structure that keep the gamer in a state of continuous fascination. One is the art direction and graphical design. Though I did lightly criticize the Sega Saturn's architecture before, noting its difficulty in rendering 3D models, these technical limitations did produce an inadvertent benefit. By having everything just a little bit difficult to make out, it gives the world not only a unique style, but it makes everything feel so alien and difficult to categorize, which in turn keeps the gamer captivated. The other element is the game's amazing soundtrack. Though I appreciated the feelings of isolation that emerged as I wandered the forbidden lands of Shadow of the Colossus in complete silence, there's something about the music playing in Saga that accentuates those feelings to the same degree, but just in a different way. The soundtrack that plays in these free-roaming sections captures the immense, awe-inspiring beauty of the levels, while occasionally drifting into those minor keys, reminding you that you are alone and surrounded by danger. In those few seconds that precede a battle, the game gave me a sense of tranquility and meditation that only a handful of other games have. When the game did eventually transition into a battle though, when the music started getting kinetic, it strangely never felt jarring. It all felt completely natural and never interrupted the game's near-perfect sense of pace. On that note, I have to say that aside from one section towards the end of Disc 2, there is not a single moment of Panzer Dragoon Saga that drags. This is in part due to the fact that the game is half as long as your typical JRPG. Where your average Final Fantasy demands 35 to 40 hours of your time, Saga demands only half of that. Though we do love our lengthy games from time to time, especially me who loves my Xenoblades and Personas, I do appreciate having a JRPG that doesn't consume months of my life while maintaining the same amount of fun and emotional impact. Now, I did promise not to mention any spoilers regarding the story, and I will hold to that. However, I did want to briefly touch on just a couple of the game's themes. I don't consider this a spoiler because the themes here are virtually present in every JRPG ever made. That said, if you don't want to know a single thing about the story, just skip to this time code you see on screen now. You have been warned. So, I have referenced Final Fantasy VII a number of times in this video, and briefly, I also mentioned Xenogears. What Panzer Dragoon Saga shares in common with those games and their respective series are two primary subjects. One, free will versus fate, and two, the struggle with God. Typically, the two subjects work hand in hand with one another, where a god or a series of gods are trying to impose a predetermined fate on humanity. But humanity courageously triumphs over God because a mortal will to struggle against adversity is more powerful than an immortal will that doesn't have to struggle against anything. If you want to learn more about these themes and why they're so prevalent, once again I will refer all of you to one of the best YouTube videos I've ever seen, titled Why Do You Always Kill Gods in JRPGs? I will leave a link to that video in the description box below. Of course, because this theme is so prevalent in JRPGs, you have to change the details to cover up the underlying pattern, or rather to make the underlying pattern feel fresh. For whatever reason, it seems like all the JRPGs in 1998 used Jewish mythology and imagery to tell their stories. In respect to Final Fantasy VII and Xenogears, they both reference several concepts from the Jewish esoteric tradition known as Kabbalah. These include the Zohar, which is the most famous Kabbalist text. There's the Sephiroth, which is equated with the body of the primordial man known as Adam Kadmon, who gave birth to all life in the universe. And there's the Chariot of God, from the Book of Ezekiel, which belongs to another branch of Jewish mysticism known as Merkabah mysticism, Merkabah being the Chariot of God. Panzer Dragoon Saga also makes references to these concepts by giving their names to the technologies from the ancient world. The Merkabah shows up, albeit under a potentially mistranslated name, Melkava. That is a ship created by the ancients to protect the aforementioned tower. There's the flagship of the Empire, known as the Greek Auric, which references the Jewish concept of the Grigori, who were a band of angels that rebelled against heaven and procreated with humans in the apocryphal Book of Enoch. The offspring of these angels and humans were a race of giants known as the Nephilim, which to you Xenogears fans should be a name that sounds familiar. And finally, the character Azel might be a reference to a specific fallen angel known as Azazel, who taught humanity how to make weapons. Just like with so many other JRPGs, the distribution of these names primarily, though not always, to the villains is purposeful. In Saga's case, it's meant to not only help provide some potential answers to Panzer Dragoon Saga's ongoing mysteries, but also be a form of philosophical commentary by the developers. No matter how stacked the deck may be against you, whether you're a boy and his dragon against godlike world-ending powers, or a team of game developers against the system, there's always a way forward, provided you have the strength of will. Maybe things won't work out the way you envisioned in the moment, but as long as you choose to persist, things that you originally thought would be impossible could come to pass, including the killing of a god. In that vein, I'm going to spark an inspirational flame in all of you. I do not want to see Panzer Dragoon Saga lost to the digital ether. I want to see it properly celebrated. So, I will be leaving a tutorial on how to emulate it in the description box below. If enough people play it, maybe Team Andromeda's sacrifice can be retroactively justified. Better yet, maybe Panzer Dragoon Saga can be remastered or remade, so an even larger number of people can play it. I want to hear from you though. Are you somebody who has played Panzer Dragoon Saga? Are you one of the fortunate souls that owns an original copy of the game? Please sound off in the comments section below, and let people know that I am not exaggerating the game's greatness. Until my next video, I want to remind you as always and as per usual, stay yellow.